Shall we switch gears, talk a little about what's going on in American science?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think kind of just setting the stage, one of the things that I was reading reports about what roughly this last week, so give or take the 7 day period prior to today. Well, I think one of the maybe unintended consequences, or maybe intended consequences of some of the decisions being made at the federal level right now here in the United States is a reduction in research funding. And so that's coming primarily in two different forms. The one is the direct decrease in funding through services like the NIH or the NSF. And the other way it's happening is through removal of the tax exempt status potentially of the universities, federal funds being taken away from universities. And I think independent of political leanings on this matter, the fear that I have is when you want something to work better, it's not usually the case that taking money away from that thing works.
Hmm.
You do have to allocate money appropriately, and you have to do it with some thought and some careful foresight. But taking away money is going to slow tech progress. And I find two ideas fundamentally opposed, but being held by the same people right now, which is America has to win, especially on the vectors of technology and AI, and
Hmm.
we should defund the universities, where all of the major progress and innovation comes. And
Hmm.
I think that thinking about this idea through the lens of delevering the universities to relever the private sector fundamentally misses how important the university systems are to the private sector. Meaning, all the
Hmm.
companies that people have heard about or care about today do not exist without basic research feeding those things from the university system. And I'm fearful that if we take money out of American universities, the desire for innovation doesn't stop; it shifts, and that money gets funded. It gets allocated to non-U.S. universities, whether that be China or Europe or otherwise.
So what do you think happens for the scientist, like the person on the common ground right now about just trying to figure out like where they go to continue the work that they're doing? Do you just kind of assume that like it has to be private sector work today?
Yeah, I think the very short term is just you have fewer people entering academia or academia adjacent jobs, and you have more of those people entering private industries. And so you get a little bit of wage stagnation, maybe
Hmm.
even suppression for those jobs, simply because you have more applicants going into those jobs. There is some conversation happening in the circles of my peer group that you begin where otherwise you wouldn't have even entertained going abroad for a job. You
Hmm.
now would be looking for that because funding sources are still plentiful there. So areas like Canada, especially Europe, where there's already good academic sciences happening, there is kind of this conversation of do we go do the research there? Where the
I see.
funding environment is maybe not ideal, but is stable and predictable, and I can count on this for the next 3, 5, 10 years. That conversation is certainly happening. Longer term, I do wonder if, especially international students, stop coming to the US
Hmm.
and we lose that as an advantage, because if all of a sudden US is not the place where the cutting edge of research is happening in whatever the preferred domain is, software, electronics, biomedicine, whatever it is, I do worry that you'll lose the talent influx and you'll drive
I see.
those would be entrepreneurs, would be leaders, researchers, etc., to other countries.
I see. Yeah, I guess I'd be curious how like I mean obviously I know like your general positioning on stuff, but like how do you look at like from your perspective about like you're just finishing up a PhD. I'm sure like you don't strike me as the sort of person who ever like wanted to do like an academia job. But just like in general, like how do you look at like the biomedical sciences? Like do you think that most of your peers are by default just saying like I'm going straight to pharma or I'm going straight to industry. Like, given that's like pretty engineering and STEM heavy, like industry is the place to continue their ambitions.
Mhm. Yeah, short answer, yes. Or you have the unfortunate pivot, which happens always in that engineering go into like financial services or something,
Oh,
right? You have these people that are pretty talented, being like, "No, I'll just go make more money working at a
yeah.
bank or something like that." And so you do have a fair number of those folks, or you have people that are joining stable companies. Less people are being attracted to like the startups of the world right now
Hmm.
because startups are inherently uncertain, even more uncertain now. You don't know what's going to happen with some of the manufacturing constraints right now. So people are kind of, I think, thinking thoughtfully around if I'm going to join a company, how insulated are they from changes that could be happening? Where do they operate? Do they operate in many markets, or are they just US based? And that kind of thing. And a lot of people would leave the university, frankly, on some sort of short term citizenship status, right? And so they have to be careful also about what companies might be sponsoring
Yeah.
them if they're going to join those. And so that's the consideration that I am fortunate enough not to have to think about. But the others, in my peer group are. Me personally, I was never really interested in academia. I don't, for whatever reason, I've identified more strongly with the desire to be in industry for most of
Hmm.
my kind of professional career. And that's just honestly because I don't really have any interest in teaching in the proper
Yeah.
sense. Like I just don't really like the classroom environment. I love it as a student. I just simply don't want to do that kind of work. And so I've always leaned industry and smaller companies over larger companies. And so much of my trajectory hasn't changed, although all of these variables factor into decision making around, what are the best areas to be in right now? What are maybe disenfranchised areas and
Hmm.
things to avoid in the short term? But generally speaking, I'm kind of the opinion that nothing is kind of ever as good or as bad as it seems, and that certainly applies here. And just in closing, if I was going to spin a positive note, I think there are opportunities for med device, pharma, the life sciences more broadly to see benefit in a more streamlined FDA process, right? A lot
Hmm.
of really great ideas kind of die pre FDA or during the FDA process because that process can be so time and capital intensive. So, even as someone who is overly critical of kind of a lot of the things that are currently happening, one, kind of avenue of optimism is that we will get a better, more efficient FDA. Cool. I'm curious, as someone who has lots of friends in a similar area, do you have kind of a counter take to anything that I just said? Are you seeing any kind of different opinions or perspectives floating from kind of your friend group?
I mean, a vast majority of my friends who are doing PhDs, they're all like computer science or ECE folks who like very clearly like they just wanted to do something that was like intellectually stimulating and pays a lot. So like a good number of them are ending up in big tech or the banks or the hedge funds sort of thing. Like I think like in my peer group, it's not, I don't think I know one person who's in a PhD because they want to teach at the end of it or end up in an academic job at the end of it. So there's like no real, same as you can say, like no actual impacted trajectory because the internships and the fellowships they're all still taking are still oriented on how do I get to the hedge fund I want to as soon as possible? How do I get to, whatever bank or
Yeah.
whatever have you, which is fun. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. I assume, if anything, those sort of roles and companies are quite immune relatively to like a lot of the stuff going on just because they trade on the shifting tides rather than
Mhm.
being victims of them.
Mhm.
um, and so yeah, I don't think I have some friends who are like clinical, like they're research oriented like clinicians, but even then I think they'd end up in like a clinical researcher capacity, like they'd be a researching doctor, not practicing doctor. um, which I don't know if that's actually going to change. If stuff like, if I would expect, like obviously NIH funding has to go towards those clinical research projects, but I don't really know how like the ecosystem spins around that sort of position. It feels in my head like it should be different, but I don't know if it actually is.
Yeah, anecdotally and through my lived experience, what ends up happening typically is anytime you have economic downturn, kind of irrespective of the catalyst for that downturn, you get a lot of your physician scientists having to shift more of their professional time to the clinic. And so a lot of these people who might be MD PhDs or be in the clinical sciences while they're also seeing patients in clinic or having some other kind of clinical duties have an allocation of time basically dedicated to research. And that fraction or that allocation of time is usually negotiated in a contract. You'll hear it called protected time,
Mm-hmm.
which means I have this much time of my week dedicated to protected time, which is like the things I can do in research. All those physician scientists typically are responsible for securing their own funding for that.
Yep.
Sometimes the institution will sponsor some of their research, therefore they will provide the funding. All that happens. But yeah, anecdotally, what you're seeing right now is a lot of those, what would be considered kind of extracurricular activities for those physician scientists are being postponed, canceled, and they're just having to spend an overwhelming majority of their time in clinics, either seeing
Yep.
patients or performing surgeries or otherwise. Great. Okay. Well, with that, we will wrap today's episode of the Scholar AI Founders Pod. Quick thank you to everyone who tuned into this episode. Reminder to catch us next week and every week thereafter. We miss a few weeks, but catch us on the typical podcast locations and find us on the YouTube channel. Thanks to you all.
Not a little, not a little.